Have you ever looked at the one person meant to be your destiny and realized they are your doom? The alpha heir stood before me, his face a mask of disgust as the mate bond flared to life between us. I thought his rejection would be the end of my story, but I was wrong. It was just the beginning. Have you ever tried to scrub a stain from stone? It's a fool's errand. The rock drinks the shame, holds it deep where no brush can reach, and the only thing your efforts earn you is the burn of lie in your lungs and the ache of surrender in your bones. The great hall of the Silver Moon Pack was made of such stone, and I felt a certain kinship with it. My own skin felt permanently stained by a crime I didn't commit, marked by a father whose name was only ever spoken as a curse. The scent of lemon polish did little to mask the damp, cloying smell of history, of judgment. My knuckles were raw, my knees screaming from hours on the cold floor. But the physical pain was a welcome distraction. It was a shield against the whispers that slithered around me like smoke. "Look at her," a voice purred from behind. Alara. Of course. Her voice was like honey, laced with glass. Still trying to wash away her father's treason. You'd have better luck scrubbing the moon from the sky, Celine. Her two friends, Betas with more ambition than sense, giggled. The sound bounced off the high vaulted ceiling, each echo a tiny, sharp stone thrown at my back. I didn't turn around. I didn't give them the satisfaction. Instead, I focused on a particularly stubborn scuff mark near the hearth, putting all my energy into the circular motion of my rag. Invisible. That was the goal. If they couldn't see me, they couldn't hurt me. It was a childish prayer, and like most of my prayers, it went unanswered. A polished boot nudged my bucket, sloshing dirty water onto the spot I'd just cleaned. "Oops," Alara said, the apology a weapon. How clumsy of me. You don't mind, do you? It's not like you have anything better to do. This was the moment, the tipping point where I could either curl up and take it, or not. A fire, hot and wild, licked up my spine. It was an old familiar fury I'd been swallowing since I was a child, a legacy from a mother I barely remembered, and a truth about my father no one else believed. What would happen if I just let it burn? If I stood up, met her smug eyes, and told her that my father was a better man than her own would ever be? But I knew what would happen, because they always had the same final word. Traitor's daughter. And that word had the power to turn my fire to ash. So I took a breath, the lion lemon scent of familiar poison. "It's fine," I muttered, my voice tight. "I'll clean it up." Just as Alara was about to deliver another verbal blow, a heavy, authoritative voice cut through the air. "That's enough." Kale, the pack's beta, and a man who looked like he'd been carved from a mountain, stood at the hall's entrance. His presence silenced Alara instantly. His gaze swept over her and her giggling companions with cold disappointment before landing on me. There was something in his eyes, something that wasn't quite pity, but wasn't disdain either. It was a weariness, a deep-seated knowledge of the pack's ugliness. He looked at me like I was a problem he didn't know how to solve. "Alara, your duties are in the training grounds, not here," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. She shot me a final, venomous look before stalking away, her friends trailing behind her like well-trained hounds. Once they were gone, Kale cleared his throat, his formality returning. He unrolled a scroll, his voice booming into the empty hall. "By order of Alpha Marcus, let it be known that the heir's selection ceremony will take place on the next full moon." He paused, letting the weight of the proclamation settle. "All unmated she-wolves of age are required to be in attendance. The future of this pack will be secured when Alpha Heir Jackson chooses his Luna." My heart hammered against my ribs. The ceremony. It was the one night every she-wolf dreamed of, and the one night I dreaded above all others. A night of hope, of destiny, of public display. I just had to get through it. Stay in the kitchens. Stay hidden. Continuing on his path, Kale's heavy footsteps paused right beside me. I kept my head down, staring at the swirling gray water in my bucket. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then a low rumble, barely a whisper. Your father. He was a good soldier, Celine. Remember that. The words were so unexpected, so contrary to everything I'd ever been told, that I couldn't even look up. Before I could process it, he was gone, his footsteps receding down the corridor. He was a good soldier. Why would he say that? What did it mean? The question hung in the air, a fragile wisp of smoke in the suffocating atmosphere of my life. My brief moment of confusion was shattered by the arrival of Martha, the head Omega. Her face was a permanent scowl, her hands planted on her wide hips. Don't think you're getting out of it, she snapped, her eyes hard as pebbles. You'll be working the ceremony, serving the guests, and you'd better not drop anything, traitor's blood. And just like that, the walls closed in. I was going to be there, on display, a servant in the middle of a fairy tale, with the stain of my name for everyone to see. The cold from the stone floor wasn't just in my knees anymore. It was seeping straight into my soul. The night of the ceremony arrived on a wave of stifling heat and nervous energy. The great hall was unrecognizable, its grim stone walls hidden behind rich crimson tapestries depicting glorious battles of Silver Moon ancestors. Hundreds of candles flickered from iron chandeliers, their light dancing across the faces of the pack, making everyone look more beautiful, more hopeful, more predatory. The air, usually smelling of old wood and wolf, was now thick with expensive perfumes, spiced wine, and the almost electric thrum of anticipation. And I was in the middle of it all, a ghost in a drab servant's uniform, my only purpose to remain unseen. My tray felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, the delicate flutes of champagne trembling with the frantic beat of my own heart. Stay in the shadows. Don't meet anyone's eyes. Just get through this. I moved along the edges of the room, my focus narrowed to the task at hand. Offer a drink, murmur a polite refusal to a drunken beta's lewd comment, and melt back into the periphery. I saw she-wolves in shimmering gowns, their laughter high and brittle as they vied for a single man's attention. It was a beautiful, terrifying performance. In another life, maybe I would have been one of them. But my bloodline had barred me from that dream before I was even old enough to have it. A sudden hush fell over the crowd, a wave of reverence that was almost a physical force. Alpha Heir Jackson had arrived. He was everything a pack could want in a future leader. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a cascade of blonde hair that fell over a face that was unfairly handsome. He moved with an easy, confident grace that commanded attention. His scent cut through the cloying perfumes. Sharp winter pine and the clean, crackling energy of a coming storm. It was a scent that promised power, and every wolf in the room seemed to lean into it. I instinctively shrank back, pressing myself against a stone pillar, making myself smaller. My eyes scanned the room, looking for anything to focus on other than the air. And then I saw him. In a carved, high-backed chair near the Alpha's dais, almost hidden in the deep shadows, sat a man whose stillness was more commanding than Jackson's grand entrance. It was King Darius of the Northern Kingdoms. What in the goddess's name was he doing here? A king didn't attend a simple heirs ceremony. His presence was an anomaly, a disruption in the natural order of things. He wasn't watching Jackson. His gaze was sweeping over the crowd with a heavy, bored intensity. His face was all harsh lines and shadow, with eyes that seemed to absorb the candlelight rather than reflect it. A chill traced its way down my spine. He was danger. Pure, apex predator danger. I needed to move. I forced my feet to unstick from the floor, turning to make another pass with my tray. "Another, if you please," a gruff voice said to my left. I turned, lifting the tray, when a laughing she-wolf stumbled backward, right into the man I was about to serve. He grunted, lurching forward directly into me. The world tilted. Time seemed to warp, stretching and slowing as the heavy silver tray flew from my hands. Champagne flutes cartwheeled through the air in a glittering arc. I stumbled forward, my balance gone, my arms flailing for something, anything, to stop my fall. I was going to crash right at the alpha air's feet. My nightmare was coming true. I collided not with the floor, but with a wall of solid muscle. Jackson's hands shot out, grabbing my arms to steady me. And then it happened. The moment his skin touched mine, a bolt of pure lightning shot through my body. It wasn't a shock. It was a connection, a white-hot current that seared a path from him to me, yanking on something deep in my soul. The air crackled. The sense of the room vanished, replaced entirely by the overwhelming power of him, pine and storm and something more, something that whispered mate. 1,000 images, 1,000 lifetimes flashed behind my eyes in a dizzying, impossible instant. A life I could never have, a love I would never know. A collective gasp sucked the air from the hall. Everyone had felt it. The sacred, undeniable snap of a fated bond igniting into existence. I looked up, my breath caught in my throat and met Jackson's eyes. For a split second, I saw the same shock I felt reflected in their blue depths. I saw the flash of destiny, the pull of the goddess's will. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by something else. Something that twisted his handsome features into a mask of pure, undiluted horror. It was a look of utter revulsion, as if he hadn't just found his fated mate, but had touched something filthy, something cursed. And in the dead silence of the great hall, under the weight of 100 pairs of eyes, that look broke me more than any physical blow ever could. Silence. It was a living creature, a heavy, suffocating beast that descended upon the great hall. It pressed in on my ears, amplifying the frantic, terrified thumping of my own heart until I was sure everyone could hear it. Every single wolf in the room was staring at me, the traitor's daughter who had somehow impossibly been chosen by fate to be their Luna, and staring at their future alpha, whose face was a canvas of absolute disgust. The bond, that beautiful, terrible spark, was still thrumming between us, a live wire of agony and longing. I could feel his shock, his fury, his revulsion as if they were my own. And it was gutting me from the inside out. Whispers began to creep back into the silence, venomous and sharp. Her? The bloodline is tainted. It's a curse. A bad omen. Jackson's father, Alpha Marcus, looked like he wanted to kill someone. His eyes, a harder, colder version of his son's, were fixed on me with murderous rage. He saw me not as a future daughter, but as a blight on his legacy. Jackson finally tore his gaze away from me and looked at his father. A silent, desperate conversation passing between them. I saw the Alpha give a nearly imperceptible shake of his head. An order. Fix this. Jackson's attention snapped back to me. The warmth of the bond was gone, replaced by a chilling frost. When he spoke, his voice was not the warm, charismatic tone of a leader, but the cold, cruel crack of a whip. This cannot be, he declared, his voice ringing with authority, aimed not just at me, but at the entire pack. The moon goddess has made a mistake. A mistake. The word was a physical blow. The bond recoiled, a wounded thing. He took a step back, creating a chasm between us. I, Alpha Air Jackson of the Silver Moon Pack, he projected, his voice void of all emotion, cannot and will not accept a mate with traitor's blood running through her veins. He looked directly into my eyes, and the world narrowed to the space between us. I reject you. The words were an incantation, a spell of breaking. And the breaking, oh goddess, the breaking. It was not a quiet snap. It was a violent, brutal tearing inside my chest, as if my very soul was being ripped in half. Pain, white-hot and absolute, exploded behind my eyes. I should have collapsed. Every wolf who endures a rejection collapses, their body and spirit shattered by the trauma. I felt my knees buckle, a gasp of pure agony escaping my lips. But as the darkness rushed in, something else rose to meet it. A strange, ancient power deep in my bones flared to life. It was a stubborn, resilient fire I never knew I possessed, a strength that wrapped around the shattered pieces of my soul and refused to let me fall. It held me up, a silent act of defiance against the crushing weight of his repudiation. Trembling from head to toe, fighting the waves of nausea and pain, I forced my spine to straighten. I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. I would not give this pack another reason to call me weak. I lifted my chin, and through the blur of unshed tears, I met his cold, triumphant gaze. My voice was quiet, yet it carried through the stunned hall as clear and sharp as a shard of ice. "I, Celine," I said, tasting my own name on my tongue as something more than a slur for the first time. "Accept your rejection, Alpha Jackson." It was done. I had taken his ultimate act of humiliation and turned it into my own declaration of survival. A new silence fell, this one laced not with shock, but with a grudging, confused respect. I had faced the ultimate disgrace and had not broken. But before anyone could speak, before Jackson could react, a sound ripped through the hall that had nothing to do with us. It was a growl, low, guttural, and so full of primal possession, it felt like the foundation of the world was shaking. It wasn't a sound of anger, it was a sound of ownership. Every head snapped towards the shadowed dais. The king. Darius was rising from his throne. He moved with a slow, deliberate deadliness, his body unfolding from the chair like a panther preparing to strike. The bored, heavy look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a pair of blazing golden irises that were locked entirely on me. The air grew thick, heavy with a power that dwarfed everyone else's, including the Alphas. The scent of pine and storm that had defined Jackson was utterly consumed by a new, dominant fragrance that stormed my senses. Ozone before a lightning strike, and the deep, ancient smell of rain-soaked earth. It was the scent of absolute authority. He took a step forward, into the light. The hall held its collective breath. His gaze never left mine as he spoke one word. The word was not a request, it was not a statement. It was a verdict, a claim, a brand. Mine. Mine. The word was not spoken. It was unleashed. A single possessive syllable that landed in the dead silence of the hall and shattered it into 1,000 pieces of panicked noise. It was a brand, seared onto my soul, and my first thought was a blast of pure, unadulterated terror. He's not talking about me. He couldn't be. The king, a figure of myth and shadow, a creature of absolute power, was not looking at me. But his eyes, 2 chips of molten gold, were pinned to me and me alone. They saw nothing else. The rest of the world had ceased to exist for him, and in turn, for me. The pain from Jackson's rejection was a distant, fading echo, swallowed by a new and far more potent wave of dread. This was worse than being broken. This was being claimed. Chaos erupted. Wolves who had been frozen in shock were now shouting, their voices a messy, confused roar. Alpha Marcus recovered first, stepping forward with a placating but firm posture. He was an alpha on his own lands, a lord in his own domain. But a king was something else entirely. "Your Majesty," Marcus began, his voice strained. "This is a Silver Moon matter. The girl is of our pack." He never finished the sentence. King Darius didn't even glance at him. He simply shifted his gaze a fraction of an inch, a silent, dismissive flick of his eyes that carried more weight than a physical blow. The alpha of the Silver Moon pack actually recoiled, his words dying in his throat, his authority turning to dust. The message was brutally clear. Your power ends where mine begins. I felt a hysterical laugh bubble in my throat. I had just been discarded by a prince only to be picked up by a god king, and I didn't know which was the crueler fate. Then the king moved. He didn't walk. He flowed through the chaos, a river of pure predatory focus, parting the sea of stunned wolves. They scrambled out of his path, their instincts screaming at them to submit. He was headed directly for me, and my own body was screaming too. Run! Where would I go? What would I do? My feet were rooted to the floor, 2 blocks of useless stone. He stopped in front of me so close I was forced to crane my neck to see his face. The scents of ozone and ancient earth I'd noticed before were now an overwhelming storm, a wild, untamed fragrance that spoke of mountains and lightning. It made the air in my lungs feel thin. "You belong to me now," he murmured, his voice a low vibration meant only for me. It wasn't a proposal. It wasn't a promise of a new life. It was a statement of ownership as simple and final as a death sentence. His hand closed around my upper arm. His grip wasn't painful, but it was absolute. A warm, inescapable manacle of flesh and bone. He began to pull me, leading me away from the center of the hall as if I were nothing more than a spoil of war. "You can't have her!" a voice finally yelled, cutting through the din. Jackson. His face was a mess of fury and disbelief. "She's accursed! She's nothing!" The king's movement paused. His head turned slowly, deliberately toward the air, and for a terrifying, heart-stopping second, the human king was gone. His golden eyes blazed with a feral, inhuman light. His lips peeled back from his teeth in a snarl that was completely wolf, a promise of a ripped throat and a bloody death. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. Jackson choked on his words, stumbling back, his bravado instantly extinguished by the sight of a true predator. Satisfied, Darius turned back and continued his inexorable pull. He dragged me past the wolves I had served, past the faces that had sneered at me my whole life. Their expressions were now a mixture of shock, fear, and a strange, warped envy. They had cast me out, and now I was being claimed by a power they could only dream of. I felt a grim, bitter satisfaction in that. They had made me an outcast, and in doing so, had somehow made me a queen's prize. The great oak doors of the hall were thrown open by guards clad in black and silver. The cold night air was a shock to my skin, a sudden, sharp gasp of reality after the suffocating heat inside. He pulled me out into the moonlight, his grip never loosening. I took one last fleeting look back at the great hall, at the only world I had ever known. Then the doors slammed shut, the sound a final, booming punctuation mark on the end of my life. I was alone in the dark with a king whose wolf had just claimed my soul, and I had no idea what kind of prison he was taking me to. The king's palace was not a home. It was a fortress of silence and power, a testament to a long line of predators. He led me through halls of polished black marble so reflective they looked like frozen lakes, my ragged servant slippers whispering against their perfect surface. Tapestries depicting brutal, bloody wars hung from the walls, their woven threads seeming to writhe in the flickering torchlight. Guards stood as still as statues in every archway, their eyes following me without ever moving their heads. There was no warmth here, no life. Only the cold, heavy weight of history and the silent promise of violence. It was the most beautiful, terrifying cage I had ever seen. Darius finally deposited me in a chamber that was larger than the entire hovel I'd grown up in. A massive four-poster bed draped in velvet sat against one wall, and a fireplace, cold and empty, was large enough to stand in. But the opulence was a lie. The windows were reinforced with elegant ironwork that was no different from bars, and 2 stoic guards were posted just outside my door. He left without a word, the heavy click of the closing door sealing my fate. I was a prisoner. Hours later, after I'd refused to touch the tray of exquisite food left for me, I was summoned. The guards escorted me not to a comfortable parlor, but to the throne room. It was a cavernous space, dominated by a throne carved from what looked like the bones of some ancient, massive beast. Darius sat upon it, a king in his natural element. But he was not alone. A council of 5 wolves, all of them old, with eyes as hard and sharp as obsidian chips, stood before him. They turned as one to look at me, their gazes stripping me bare, judging me, and finding me wanting. "This is the one?" A sharp-faced she-wolf with silver hair sneered. Her scent was like bitter herbs. A Packless Omega with traitor's blood. She used witchcraft to ensnare the king's wolf. The bond is an abomination, a danger to this throne. The other council members murmured in agreement. My fear, which had been a cold knot in my stomach, began to burn with a hot spark of anger. I was not a thing to be discussed. I was not a curse. I used nothing, I said, my voice shaking but clear. I did nothing. This was not my choice. The she-wolf, whose name I learned was Lyra, laughed, a dry, rasping sound. You expect us to believe that fate chose you for our king? A nobody? You are either a liar or a fool. I opened my mouth to retort, but Darius finally spoke. Enough, Lyra. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension like a razor. He rose from the throne and descended the dais, coming to stand beside me. He didn't touch me, but his presence was a shield. She is my fated. Her presence here is my will, and that is all the justification this council requires. The wolves bowed their heads in submission, but their eyes still burned with suspicion. Darius had defended me, and a small, treacherous part of me felt a sliver of gratitude. Then he turned his head, his gaze meeting mine, and the gratitude died. Do not mistake this for affection, he said, his voice a low, cold current meant only for me. My wolf has chosen, but I have not. You are a complication I must now manage. You will stay here, you will be protected, and you will do exactly as I say. His wolf has chosen, but I have not. The words echoed in my head as I was dismissed, sent back to my beautiful empty room. He hadn't rescued me. He had simply acquired a problem. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I stared into the darkness, the king's conflicting words wrestling in my mind. A floorboard creaked near the window. I sat up, my heart instantly pounding. It wasn't one of the guards. This was a soft, stealthy sound. A shadow detached itself from the velvet curtains, a human shape moving with inhuman silence. A glint of metal caught the faint moonlight filtering through the window. Silver. A knife. A scream died in my throat. I scrambled backward on the bed, my hand fumbling for something, anything, to use as a weapon. The assassin lunged, a silent blur of black cloth and deadly intent. I threw a heavy pillow, a useless gesture, and rolled off the far side of the bed as the knife sliced through the air where I'd just been. I landed hard on the floor, the breath knocked out of me. The shadow was on me in an instant, a knee pressing into my chest, the point of the silver blade pressing against my throat. I saw nothing of his face, only the cold, murderous intent in his eyes. And then the world exploded. The door to my chamber burst inward, torn from its hinges. Darius was a storm, a blur of fury and motion. He wasn't a king anymore. He was a beast. His eyes were blazing gold, a feral snarl ripping from his chest as he crossed the room in a single, impossible leap. He slammed into the assassin, and the sound of the impact was a sickening crunch of bone. The fight was over before it began. It wasn't a fight. It was an execution. Darius stood over the crumpled body, his chest heaving, his wolf roaring just beneath his skin. Then, his feral, glowing gaze turned to me. He had just saved my life, but as I looked at the unrestrained predator before me, I had to wonder if he was the far greater danger. His eyes dropped to my arm, where a thin line of red was welling up. The assassin's blade had nicked me. His expression was utterly terrifyingly unreadable. The aftermath was almost as violent as the attack itself. The scent of blood, sharp and metallic, filled my opulent prison cell, a stark, ugly stain on the perfumed air. 2 royal guards, their faces grim, dragged the assassin's body from the room with unnerving efficiency, leaving behind only a dark smear on the priceless rug. Reality was sinking its teeth in. This wasn't just a political game of whispers and accusations. It was a game of knives in the dark. Someone wanted me dead, and I had no idea who or why. I sat on the edge of the massive bed, my body trembling uncontrollably, while a quiet, nervous healer dabbed a foul-smelling ointment onto the shallow cut on my arm. My skin stung, but the pain was distant, unreal. All I could feel was the ghost of that silver blade at my throat. Darius hadn't left. He stood in the ruined doorway, a silent, brooding statue of rage. The feral gold had receded from his eyes, but his posture was still coiled tight, a predator held in check by a thread of will. He watched the healer's every move, his gaze fixed on the small wound on my arm. Was he angry that his new property had been damaged? The thought was as chilling as it was likely. A guard appeared at his side, bowing low and speaking in a hushed tone. Though his voice was quiet, the words carried in the tense silence of the room. "Your Majesty, the Alpha heir is at the gates. Jackson. He's demanding an audience." The guard hesitated. "He is making a scene, shouting about a curse, swearing vengeance on her." My blood ran cold. Jackson. Of course, it wasn't enough to reject me, to publicly humiliate me. Now he was painting a target on my back, fueling the hatred of his pack, and it seemed giving assassins a reason to come for me. He was turning my name into a war cry. This nightmare wasn't ending. It was just beginning a new, bloodier chapter. The healer finished, tying a clean linen bandage around my arm before scurrying away, clearly terrified to be in the king's presence a moment longer than necessary. We were alone. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken words and the scent of blood. I couldn't take it anymore. This gilded cage, this life-or-death game, I wanted no part of it. I stood up, my legs still shaky, and faced him. "This is because of me," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. "He's out there, calling me a curse, and someone already tried to kill me. This is your world, Darius, not mine." I took a breath, gathering every ounce of defiance I had left. "Let me go. I don't want your protection, I don't want this palace, and I don't want you." I tried to push back against the faint, infuriating pull that had started to form between us, the echo of a bond I refused to acknowledge. "Just let me disappear." He was across the room in 2 long, silent strides. Suddenly he was there, looming over me, his sheer size and power sucking all the air from my vicinity. He looked down at me, his face an unyielding mask of stone, but his eyes held a dangerous, flickering light. "Go where?" he asked, and his voice was so dangerously soft it was more frightening than any shout. "Back to the pack that mocked you your entire life? To the loving arms of the Alpha who threw you away like trash and now screams for your death at my gates?" He leaned in closer, his scent of storm and earth an intoxicating, terrifying wave. "There is no out for you anymore, Celine. Do you understand? Your obscurity is gone. The moment my wolf claimed you, your old life was burned to the ground." His gaze was relentless, pinning me in place. "Your only reality is here, with me." The finality in his words was like a physical blow, stealing the last of my fight. He was right. There was nowhere to run. I was trapped. His gaze dropped to the new bandage on my arm. Gently, almost reverently, his fingers brushed against the linen. The touch was electric, an unwanted spark that shot up my arm, a traitorous jolt of heat. My breath hitched. He lifted his eyes back to mine, his expression dark, possessive, and utterly absolute. "You may hate me," he whispered, the sound a chilling, intimate vow. "But you will live." He paused, letting the weight of his promise settle deep into my bones. "Even if I must kill the world for you." Days in the king's palace bled into one another, each one a perfect, suffocating copy of the last. My life, which had once been defined by the rough texture of a cleaning rag and the constant ache in my back, was now a strange pantomime of luxury. I was a doll being dressed in silks that felt like lies against my skin, served food on silver platters that tasted like ash in my mouth, and followed by guards whose silent presence was a constant reminder of my cage. The maids who attended to me never quite met my eyes, their movements quick and efficient, as if touching me might be contagious. I was a ghost haunting these opulent halls, a living omen that everyone wished would just disappear. I was protected, yes, but I had never felt more alone. Tonight, my performance was to be at a formal dinner with Darius and his council. The king had decreed it, his word as unbending as iron. So I let them lace me into a gown the color of a midnight sky, its fabric cool and heavy. I walked beside Darius into the dining hall, my head held high, my face a carefully constructed mask of indifference. I could feel their eyes on me instantly. The council lords and ladies, the same ones who had called me an abomination, now offered thin, brittle smiles. Lyra, the sharp-faced she-wolf with the silver hair, watched me with the undisguised hunger of a vulture. The whispers started before I even sat down. Such a plain little thing. The king must be enchanted. An omen, I tell you. A blight on the throne. I focused on the intricate patterns of the silverware, on the way the candlelight gleamed on the polished wood of the long table. I tried to make myself small, to retreat into the fortress of my own mind. They discussed pack business, trade disputes, and reports of rogues near the southern border. I was an ornament, a silent, unwilling decoration at the king's side. Darius himself was a formidable presence, listening more than he spoke, his quiet questions cutting to the heart of every matter. He hadn't spoken a word directly to me since we'd entered the room. Then, a younger lord named Valerius, with eager eyes and a desire to prove his worth, turned his attention to me. The table fell silent. "My lady Celine," he began, his voice overly formal. "Your former pack is near the disputed Sunstone River. What is your perspective on the Silver Moon's claim to the eastern bank?" The question was a stone thrown into a still, silent pond. Everyone stared, expecting, what? Tears? Stuttering? Silence? They saw me as a witless omega, a piece of property. The old Celine would have shrunk from the attention, her face burning with shame. But something had changed in me since that night. I had been shattered and claimed, and in the wreckage a hard, defiant thing had been forged. I thought of Cale's strange words. He was a good soldier. I remembered my father, not as a traitor, but as a man who would sit with me and trace the pack territories on an old map, his voice full of respect for the land. I met Lord Valerius's gaze. "The Eastern Bank has always been hunting ground," I said, my voice steady. "The soil is too rocky for farming, and the river floods in the spring. Silver Moon has never had a use for it, except to say that they own it." It was a simple observation, not a political strategy. But it was truth, spoken plainly. The council members exchanged surprised glances. Lyra's lips thinned into a displeased line. I chanced to look at Darius. He was watching me, his head tilted slightly, and for the first time, the look in his dark eyes was not one of irritation or cold duty. It was surprise, and something else, something I couldn't name. The conversation eventually moved on, but the dynamic had shifted. I was no longer just an object. I had spoken. I existed. When the long dinner finally concluded, Lord Valerius, perhaps emboldened by the king's lack of reprimand, stepped to my side as I rose. "Allow me, my lady," he said, offering me his arm. It was a simple, polite courtesy, a gesture offered to any high-born lady. Unthinking, I placed my hand on his forearm. A low, rumbling sound vibrated through the entire room, seeming to come from the very stones. It was a growl, deep, guttural, and absolutely lethal. It came from the king's chest. Valerius snatched his hand away from me as if he'd been burned, his face instantly pale with terror. He took 2 quick steps back, bowing his head in submission. I stared at Darius, my heart hammering against my ribs. His face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes fixed on the spot where Valerius's hand had just been. He was looking at my arm as if the young lord had branded me, had dared to touch something that belonged exclusively and absolutely to him. Sleep was a shallow, restless thing, haunted by golden eyes and the memory of a possessive growl. I was drifting in that gray space between dream and wakefulness when a sound tore me from it. It was a roar. Not a human shout of anger, but a deep, guttural sound of pure agony that seemed to shake the palace to its very foundations. It was a sound of something breaking, of a creature being torn apart from the inside out. My body went rigid with fear, my hand instinctively clutching the velvet blanket. Another roar, This one closer was followed by the sickening crack of bone. I slipped out of bed, my feet silent on the cold floor. I crept to my door and pressed my ear against the heavy wood. Silence. The guards who were always there, were gone. Had they fled? Or had something happened to them? Against every instinct for self-preservation I possessed, I turned the handle. The door swung open into an empty, torch-lit hallway. The agonized sounds were coming from deeper within the palace, a terrible magnetic pull on my senses. I should have stayed in my room. I should have locked the door and hidden under the bed. Instead, I started walking. My bare feet made no sound on the marble as I followed the terrible noises through the sleeping palace. They led me past the throne room, beyond the council chambers, to a set of large doors that stood ajar, leading out into the night. A cool breeze carrying the scent of damp earth and something wild, something metallic, drifted towards me. The sounds were coming from out there. I pushed the door open and slipped outside into a vast stone courtyard used for training, and I saw him. Under the cold white light of the moon, King Darius was on his knees. His body was a horror of unnatural angles, convulsing violently. The fine silk shirt he wore was torn to shreds across his back, and I could see his skin shifting, his muscles writhing as if they had a life of their own. His bones were cracking, elongating, snapping into new shapes as he fought against a transformation. He was trying to stop his wolf from coming out, and the battle was tearing him apart. A low, pained snarl escaped his lips, his head thrown back as his spine arched unnaturally. This wasn't the beautiful, romantic shift I'd heard about in stories. This was agony. This was a war. He must have scented me. His head snapped in my direction, and the face he turned to me was caught halfway between man and beast. His features were elongated, his teeth sharpened to points, and his eyes were no longer human. They were two blazing gold pits of pure, feral instinct. "Get away from me," he snarled, the words a mangled wreck of a human voice and a wolf's growl. He was losing. The beast was winning. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to run, to flee from the monster that was about to be fully unleashed. But I was frozen, mesmerized by the terrible, violent beauty of his struggle. And beneath the fear, some other instinct was stirring. The faint, thrumming connection between us, the one I had been fighting so hard to deny, was now a humming wire of shared pain. I could feel his agony as a phantom echo in my own body. Instead of running, I took a single, hesitant step forward onto the cold stones of the courtyard. "Darius," I whispered, my voice barely audible. His head jerked up, his golden eyes locking onto me. He snarled, a clear warning this time. "Stay back." But I didn't. I took another step. I don't know why. Maybe it was the bond. Maybe it was a flicker of pity for a creature in so much pain. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the first truly brave thing I had ever done. "It's okay," I said, my voice a little stronger now. "You're okay. Hear my voice. Just hear me." My words seemed to cut through the fog of his pain. The violent convulsions lessened, his body trembling on the very precipice of the change. He stared at me, his form shuddering, caught between two worlds. He was still a monster, but for the first time, he looked lost. Slowly, my hand trembling so hard I could barely control it, I reached out. My mind screamed that this was madness, that he would rip my arm from its socket. I ignored it. My fingers brushed against the bare skin of his arm where the shirt had been torn away. His skin was burning hot, his muscles bunched like solid iron beneath it. The moment I made contact, it was like a lightning rod grounding a storm. The violent energy convulsing through him just stopped. The tension snapped. With a shuddering, ragged gasp, he collapsed forward, catching himself on his hands, his head hanging low. The terrible shifting ceased. He was still a man. My touch had been an anchor in the storm of his own nature. He stayed there for a long moment, his chest heaving. Then, slowly, he lifted his head and looked at me. The feral gold in his eyes had softened, the beast retreating to leave only the man, staring at me with an expression of raw disbelief and a shocking, heart-stopping vulnerability. For the first time, he wasn't looking at me like a complication or a possession. He was looking at me like I was a miracle. My hand was still on his arm, a fragile, terrifying bridge between us, forged in pain and moonlight. And just behind me, from the shadows of the doorway, I heard a guard's hushed, fearful whisper. "The council is right. Her presence is destabilizing the king." The next day, the fragile connection forged in the moonlight was gone, shattered by the cold light of dawn. Darius was once again the remote, unreadable king. He avoided me, his gaze sliding past me as if I were made of glass. If he felt anything about what had happened between us, gratitude, confusion, fear, he buried it deep beneath his royal mask. But the palace itself felt different. The tension was thicker, the whispers from the council more pointed. Lyra and her allies watched me with open hostility now, their suspicion curdling into outright hatred. They had seen my strange influence over their king, and it terrified them. The anchor I had provided for Darius had just secured my own feet in cement, ready to be thrown into the sea. Desperate for a breath of air that didn't taste of suspicion and intrigue, I found my way to the palace gardens. It was a rare moment of freedom, a sprawling labyrinth of sculpted hedges and blooming nightshade. Guards were still posted at the perimeter, a constant reminder of my gilded prison, but here, at least, I could pretend I was alone. The scent of damp earth and sweet florals was a balm to my frayed nerves. I sank onto a stone bench, hidden away in a small alcove, and closed my eyes. "I knew I'd find you here." My eyes snapped open. A figure stepped out from behind a towering hedge of blood-red roses. Jackson. My breath caught in my throat. How had he gotten in here? His face, once so handsome and confident, was now gaunt, his eyes wild with a feverish obsession. He looked like a man haunted. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice a raw, desperate rasp. He took a step towards me, and I immediately shot to my feet. "Stay away from me," I warned, my voice trembling. Where were the guards? "It wasn't my choice," he pleaded, ignoring my warning and advancing again. "My father, the council, the pressure of the pack. They said your blood was a curse, but the only curse is living without you." He sounded insane, his words a torrent of self-pity and blame. "The bond, I still feel it, don't you? It's not too late. You're mine." "I am not yours," I spat, backing away until my shoulders hit the cold stone wall of a fountain. "You threw me away." "I'll get you back," he snarled, his desperation twisting into something ugly and possessive. Before I could scream, before I could even think, he lunged. His hands grabbed my arms, his fingers digging into my flesh like claws. He slammed me against the wall, his body pinning me. "I'll fix this." And then his mouth was on mine. It wasn't a kiss. It was an assault. A brutal, bruising act of ownership, meant to punish and reclaim. It tasted of poison, of stale wine and the bitter tang of regret. I struggled against him, my hands pushing uselessly against his chest. A strangled sob caught in my throat. This was a nightmare. This was a violation, a blur of motion, a sound like a thunderclap. Jackson was ripped away from me with impossible strength, flying through the air and slamming into the far stone wall with a sickening crunch. He crumpled to the ground, groaning. Darius stood where Jackson had been, a figure of absolute, terrifying fury. His face was a mask of cold death, but his body betrayed the inferno raging within him. His claws, long, black, and lethal, had sliced through the skin of his fingertips. A murderous growl, deeper and more terrifying than any I had heard from him before, tore from his chest. "I will tear you limb from limb," he snarled. and his voice was no longer human. It was the beast, promising a bloody, painful death. He stalked towards the groaning, pathetic form of the alpha heir, every movement radiating lethal intent. He was going to kill him. Right here. "Stop!" The scream was ripped from my throat, raw and desperate. The sound of my voice was the only thing in the world that could have reached him. He froze, his claws inches from Jackson's throat, his entire body trembling with the effort of holding back the kill. With a final, disgusted snarl, he straightened up and gestured sharply. Royal guards, who had appeared as if from nowhere, swarmed Jackson, dragging the terrified and broken heir away, presumably to the dungeons. Darius turned to face me. His fury was still there, but it had been banked, transformed into a cold, terrifying pressure that was almost worse than the open rage. His golden eyes swept over me, and I felt like a flaw, a disruption he was moments away from eliminating. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, I heard voices. They came from a nearby alcove, hidden by a thick trellis of ivy. It was Lyra, and her voice was a deadly, sibilant whisper. "This proves it. She is a magnet for chaos. He almost killed an alpha heir for her." Another voice murmured in agreement. Then Lyra spoke again, her tone dropping to one of finality and treason. "If the king won't get rid of her, then the council will have to do it for him." I was frozen solid, caught between the chilling, possessive wrath of the king before me and the certain deadly plotting of his council just feet away. I wasn't just a prisoner anymore, I was a dead woman walking. Paranoia is a slow poison. For 3 days it had been seeping into my veins, a constant cold dread that made every shadow in my opulent room look like a lurking assassin. Every meal was a threat, every drink a potential death sentence. I pushed a piece of roasted pheasant around my plate with a silver fork, the rich aroma of rosemary and garlic turning my stomach. How could I eat when I knew Lyra and her cronies were plotting my end? I was a lamb waiting for the slaughter, and the waiting was its own special kind of torture. I trusted no one. Not the stone-faced guards outside my door, not the silent maids who flitted in and out, and certainly not the king, who had been a ghost since the incident in the garden, his presence in the palace a heavy, unseen weight. Then came a soft knock at my door. It wasn't the firm, official rap of a guard. My heart leaped into my throat. I didn't answer. The door creaked open anyway, and a young maid I recognized peeked her head in. Her name was Lena, a quiet girl with wide, fearful eyes who, unlike the others, had sometimes offered me a small, fleeting smile. She was carrying a single steaming cup on a small tray. "My lady," she whispered, stepping inside. I brought you some tea. My grandmother's recipe. It helps with troubled sleep." I stared at her, my posture rigid. "I didn't ask for tea." "I know," she said, her gaze dropping to the floor. She placed the cup on the table beside me. The steam smelled sweet, of chamomile and honey. "It's just, I hear what they say about you in the halls, the council. It isn't right." She finally looked up, and her eyes were shining with what looked like genuine sympathy. "You're not a curse. You shouldn't be treated this way." Her words, they were like a drop of water on a parched tongue, a single, kind voice in a world of whispers and hate. I was so starved for a human connection, for one person to look at me and not see a problem to be eliminated, that my paranoia faltered. Was it possible that not everyone in this stone fortress was my enemy? Could I trust this one girl? I wanted to. Goddess, I wanted to believe her. "Thank you, Lena," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. She gave me another one of her small, watery smiles and slipped out of the room, leaving me with the warm, fragrant cup. I picked it up, the ceramic warm against my cold hands. It was just tea. A simple act of kindness, a gesture of solidarity. I took a sip. It was sweet and calming, the honey coating my throat. I took another, deeper drink, letting the warmth spread through my chest. For a single, blissful moment, a knot of tension I hadn't even realized I was carrying loosened. And then the burning started. It began as a spark in the pit of my stomach, a tiny coal of heat that quickly exploded into a raging inferno. Fire shot through my veins, a liquid agony that made me gasp. The teacup shattered on the floor. I doubled over, a choked cry tearing from my throat. My vision swam, the candlelight of the room blurring into streaks of painful light. Through the haze, I saw the door open again. Lena stood there, her face a mask of horrified, tearful regret. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed, her hand pressed to her mouth. "My family, my brother, they threatened them. I had no choice." The betrayal was a blade of ice, colder and sharper than any poison. I tried to speak, to scream, to curse her, but my throat was closing up. My limbs began to convulse, my body no longer my own. The world tilted, the floor rushing up to meet me as my strength gave out completely. Darkness, pain, then flashes of nightmare. The sound of a door being splintered into 1,000 pieces, a roar of pure, unrestrained fury that was more beast than man. The scent of ozone and a king's rage. The world swam back into a blurry, agonizing focus for a single, searing moment. I was being held. Strong arms were wrapped around me, lifting me as if I weighed nothing. I looked up into Darius's face. It was stripped bare of his royal mask, of all his cold control. It was the face of a man watching his world burn. His agony was a palpable force, a storm I could feel on my skin. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking up, at the ceiling, at the sky, at the goddess herself, and the sound that ripped from his throat was the most broken thing I had ever heard. "Don't take her!" he roared, his voice cracking with a desperate, feral plea. "Not again! Do you hear me? Take me instead!" His anguish was the last thing I felt before the darkness swallowed me whole, a desperate cry from a king begging fate on behalf of a girl he claimed not to want. Waking up was a slow, gentle drift. I surfaced from a deep, dreamless ocean of black, my first sensation not of pain, but of a strange, quiet humming beneath my skin. It felt like a new current of energy, a cool, clean fire flowing through my veins where the poison's heat had been. The agony was gone. I felt weak, yes, but also whole, more whole than I had ever been. I opened my eyes. The ceiling above me was not the familiar carved plaster of my chamber, but dark, exposed wooden beams. The air smelled different, too, not of perfume and dread, but of old leather, wood smoke, and the crisp scent of the outdoors. The scent of him. I turned my head. I was in the king's bed, a vast expanse of dark furs and clean linen, and slumped in a heavy armchair beside me, his head fallen back at an awkward angle, was Darius. He was asleep, and the sight stole the breath from my lungs. Every ounce of his formidable, intimidating power had been stripped away by sheer exhaustion. His face, usually a mask of unyielding control, was unguarded, vulnerable. There were dark circles under his eyes, and a line of strain was etched between his brows. He looked like a man who had been through a war. For me. A quiet cough brought my attention to the other side of the room. The royal healer, a kind-faced old man, bowed his head. "My lady, it is a relief to see you awake." "What happened?" I whispered, my throat dry. "You were poisoned," he said, his voice grave. "A lethal concentration of wolfsbane. By all rights. You should not be alive." He looked at me with a mixture of awe and confusion. "We did everything we could, but the poison was too strong, too fast. We could not stop it." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "But then, it simply vanished. Your body, it healed itself. It is a miracle I cannot explain. A miracle. Or something else." I looked down at my hands, feeling that strange humming power again. The healer's words were interrupted by a sharp intake of breath. Darius was awake, his eyes snapped open, landing on me, and for a split second I saw a tidal wave of undiluted relief so profound it was like a physical blow. Then, just as quickly, the mask was back. The king returned. "How do you feel?" he asked, his voice a low, rough rasp from sleep. "Alive," I answered, and the word felt enormous. He nodded, pushing himself out of the chair. He looked as if he hadn't slept in days. "In my search for an antidote," he began, his tone all business now. "I had your old quarters in the Silver Moon pack house searched. Torn apart, actually." A grim, humorless smile touched his lips for an instant. "I didn't find any herbs that could help." He walked over to a heavy oak desk. "But I found this." He returned with a small, worn leather pouch tied with a faded ribbon. He placed it in my hand. It was light, almost weightless. With trembling fingers, I untied the ribbon and emptied the contents onto the fur blanket. A single folded parchment, yellowed with age, fell out. It was sealed with a wax crest I didn't recognize. A snarling wolf's head crowned with a crescent moon. The crest of the former king. His father. "It was hidden beneath a floorboard," Darius said, his voice quiet, watching me. I broke the seal. The letter was written in a delicate, feminine hand. It was addressed to my mother, Alora. It was from the old king. My heart pounded as I read the elegant script, and with every word, the entire world, my entire identity, was unwritten and then rewritten anew. "My dearest Alora," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I have failed, and your brave mate, my most loyal friend, has fallen protecting me. Know this and never let them tell you otherwise. Ronan did not betray me. He died saving my life from the vipers in my own council, Hale, Valerius, and Lyra's father, Lord Tristan. They orchestrated the attack, and when it failed, they silenced your Ronan and branded him a traitor to cover their own treason." A sob caught in my throat. My father. A hero. Not a traitor. The shame I had carried my entire life began to burn away, replaced by a hot, righteous fury. But the letter wasn't finished. "You must protect the child you carry. Protect our Celine. Her blood is not a curse, it is the most sacred of blessings. She is of the first line, a direct descendant of the first Luna, blessed by the goddess herself at the dawn of our time. This is why I have kept you hidden, why Ronan guarded you so closely. Her blood holds a power they cannot comprehend, a resilience against death, a connection to the very soul of our people. She is not meant for a simple life. She is destiny." The letter fell from my fingers. I was destiny. The strange power I'd felt, the fire that had held me up during the rejection, the coolness that had fought the poison. It was my blood, my birthright, from the first Luna. The shame that had been the foundation of my life crumbled into dust, and on its ruins, a pillar of incandescent rage and purpose began to rise. I looked up at Darius, the last tear I would ever shed for my father's name drying on my cheek. For the first time, there was no fear in my gaze, only fire. "They will pay for what they did to him," I said, and my voice was not the whisper of a broken Omega. It was the low, dangerous promise of a queen. Walking into the throne room felt like walking into my own legend. Just yesterday, I would have entered this hall with my head bowed, a frightened girl playing dress-up. Today, I walked with my spine straight, the ghost of my father at one shoulder and the power of the first Luna humming in my veins. Darius was at my other side, his presence a silent, solid wall of support. He had ordered the entire council to assemble, and as we entered, I saw them. The lords and ladies who had whispered about me, judged me, and tried to murder me. Lyra stood at their center, her face a mask of cold composure. But I saw the flicker of pure shock in her eyes as she saw me. Alive, healthy, whole. She had expected to be meeting with a grieving king, not a resurrected ghost. A heavy silence fell over the room, thick with tension and the scent of fear. Darius didn't bother with pleasantries. He strode to the center of the room and, with a flick of his wrist, sent the old king's letter spinning onto the polished stone table. It slid to a stop directly in front of Lyra. "Explain this," Darius commanded, his voice deceptively quiet. Yet it rolled through the cavernous hall like thunder. Lyra's eyes darted to the letter, to the familiar royal seal. Panic, stark and ugly, flashed across her features before she could hide it. Her composure, so perfect and practiced, began to crack. "Your Majesty," she began, her voice tight. This is an outrage, a forgery, a trick concocted by this creature to sow discord." "A trick?" Darius's voice dropped even lower, becoming a dangerous purr. "My father's own seal? His words confessing your father's treason? Do you take me for a fool, Lyra?" She was cornered, a trapped animal, and like any trapped animal, she chose to bite. Her fear twisted into a fanatical, shrieking fury. "The letter proves our point," she screeched, pointing a trembling finger at me. "It proves how dangerous she is. You heard the healer? She survived a poison that should have killed an alpha in seconds. That bloodline? It isn't a blessing. It's a weapon. A power outside of our control that will bring ruin to this kingdom." She turned her frantic gaze upon the other council members, the ones whose fathers had been named alongside her own. They saw their one and only path to survival. "The ancient law is clear," Lyra cried, her voice rising with hysteria. "Any being, any power, that poses a direct and uncontrollable threat to the stability of the throne must be eliminated. It is our sworn duty to protect this kingdom. We, the King's Council, decree that she must die." "She must die," another lord echoed, his face pale with sweat. "It is the law." The throne room fell silent once more. The decree had been made. It was the council's most sacred and final power, the right to condemn a threat to the throne. They all turned to look at Darius. He was the king, the ultimate authority, but he was also bound by the ancient laws of his kingdom. His face was unreadable, a mask of carved stone. Would he follow the law that had governed his people for 1,000 years? Or would he follow the pull of a bond his human side claimed not to want? My heart hammered in my chest. This was the moment, his choice. He looked at the council, at their faces, twisted with a desperate, self-serving righteousness. He saw the rot that had festered at the heart of his kingdom for a generation. Then, his gaze moved to me. He saw me standing there, not as a frightened Omega, but as the daughter of a hero, the heir to a sacred legacy, a woman who had walked through the valley of death and had come back stronger. Slowly, deliberately, he moved. He crossed the space between us and came to stand directly in front of me, his back to the council. He was a living shield, a fortress of muscle and will between me and my executioners. "I am the king," he said, his voice quiet, but each word was imbued with absolute, unshakable power. "And I refuse your decree." It was a declaration of war, a king choosing a fated mate over his own government. Gasps of shock and horror rippled through the council. Lyra looked as if he had physically struck her. Before she could unleash another tirade, Darius gestured to his royal guard. "Arrest them," he commanded. "All of them. Treason is not a matter for debate." As the guards swarmed the protesting council members, dragging them away, another figure burst into the throne room. A young guard, his face white with panic. He skidded to a halt, bowing hastily before the king. "Your Majesty," he gasped out of breath. "A message. From the dungeons. It's the Alpha heir, Jackson." Darius turned, his posture immediately rigid. "What about him?" The guard was trembling. "He's begun a ritual, sire. Blood magic. The prison mages say it's an old and forbidden rite. A rite of severance. They say it's designed to forcibly tear a fated bond apart from a distance." He looked at me, his eyes wide with terror. "If he completes it, it won't just break your connection. The mages say it will shred her very soul." The guard's frantic words, "a rite of severance, it will shred her very soul," crashed through the throne room, and the calculated order Darius had just imposed was shattered into pure chaos. He became a storm of controlled fury, his voice a low, lethal weapon as he dispatched his royal guard to the dungeons with orders that left no room for error. "Stop that ritual. Use any means necessary short of killing him. I want him alive to answer for this." He turned to me then, and in the depths of his eyes, beneath the rage, I saw a flicker of something I hadn't seen there before. Fear. It was a raw, primal fear that he couldn't quite hide. He crossed the space between us in 2 long strides, his hands coming up to grip my shoulders. "They will not succeed," he said. And it was a vow. A sacred oath sworn to me in the middle of chaos. He led me from the throne room, not to my gilded cage, but deeper into the palace, to a hidden study I'd never seen before. It was his private sanctum, a room that smelled of old books, wood smoke, and him. While mages were summoned and the palace was turned upside down in a desperate search for a counterspell, he kept me there, a silent, brooding sentinel at my side. The news from the mages was grim. The ritual Jackson had started was ancient, feeding on resentment and powered by blood. Once the incantation had begun, it could not be stopped by conventional means. Only the death of the caster could sever it completely. "Killing him could spark a war with the Silvermoon Pack," Darius said later, his voice a low rumble as he stared into the crackling fireplace. The mages were gone, leaving behind only their grim prognosis and a heavy blanket of despair. "His father is a proud man. He would see it as an act of aggression, not justice." The silence stretched between us, filled only by the hiss and pop of the flames. I watched his profile, the hard line of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders. He carried the weight of a kingdom, and I had just added the weight of my own soul to the burden. "Why?" I asked, the question a soft whisper in the quiet room. "Why did you scream, 'Not again,' when I was poisoned?" He went still, his body rigid. For a long moment I thought he wouldn't answer, that he would retreat behind the walls of the king. When he finally spoke, his voice was a rough, scarred thing, full of a pain he had clearly kept buried for a very long time. "I had a mate before you," he began, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "Her name was Alara. It was a political match, arranged by my father to secure an alliance. There was no bond between us, only duty." He paused, and a muscle jumped in his jaw. "I respected her. I was sworn to protect her, and I failed." My heart ached for the cold duty in his voice, for the ghost of a woman he had never loved but had been chained to. A rival kingdom sent assassins. They used a poison, a fast-acting neurotoxin derived from a rare flower. It was meant for me. He closed his eyes, and I could see the memory playing out in the tense lines of his face. "She drank the wine first. By the time I realized what had happened, it was too late. I was too late." He opened his eyes, and the firelight reflected in their depths looked like a fresh, bleeding wound. My wolf, a wolf's deepest, most primal instinct is to protect its mate. When she died, it broke something in him. He saw it as his ultimate failure. He finally turned to look at me, and his gaze was raw, stripped of all pretense. "When I saw you on the floor, dying from that poison," he felt it all over again. The failure, the loss. He could not bear it. A second time. And then I understood. His feral rage, his suffocating possessiveness, his desperate plea to the goddess. It wasn't just about a bond forced upon him. It was about a deep, unhealed wound. It was about the beast inside him howling in grief over a failure he could never forgive. For the first time, I didn't see a terrifying king or a possessive captor. I saw a man haunted by ghosts, his wolf's instincts forever intertwined with a tragedy. A fragile, tentative thread of trust began to weave itself around my heart. He was more than just a monster. As that vulnerable, silent understanding hung in the air between us, a new sound shattered the peace. A loud, clanging bell. An alarm, ringing frantically from the courtyard. Shouts echoed from the hallway. We looked at each other, the brief moment of connection instantly broken. The stained glass window of the study exploded inward, showering the room in a rainbow of deadly shards. Two figures clad in black leather, the insignia of the traitorous council lords on their armor, tumbled through the broken frame, their silver daggers already drawn. They were not here for the king. Their eyes, cold and merciless, were fixed on me. The explosion of glass and the sudden invasion of armed men happened in a split second. But for me, time seemed to slow to a crawl. Darius moved before the first shard of stained glass even hit the floor. He shoved me behind him with a force that sent me stumbling back against his heavy desk, his body becoming a living shield. A snarl, so feral and full of hate it was barely human, was ripped from his chest. "You will not touch her," he roared, and then the study erupted into a whirlwind of brutal, close-quarters combat. I watched, my heart hammering against my ribs, as the king became a tempest of fluid, lethal motion. He didn't fight with the clumsy rage of a brawler. He moved with the deadly, economical grace of a born predator. He ducked under the wild slash of one assassin's blade, his hand shooting out to snap the man's wrist with a sickening crack. He spun, using the first man's body as a shield against the second, his other hand catching the descending knife hand of his new opponent. The assassins were skilled, but they were men fighting a king. And the king was fighting like a beast protecting its mate. I wouldn't be useless. I wouldn't just cower while he fought for my life. My eyes darted around the room, landing on a heavy, leather-bound book on the corner of the desk. As the second assassin shoved Darius back, creating a momentary opening, I grabbed the tome and hurled it with all my strength. It struck the man square in the side of the head. His focus faltered for a fraction of a second, and a fraction of a second was all Darius needed. He drove his elbow into the man's throat, and the assassin crumpled to the ground, gagging. The fight was over. Silence descended, broken only by our ragged, heavy breaths. Dust motes danced in the moonlight streaming through the shattered window. Adrenaline, sharp and sweet, sang in my veins. The shared danger, the life and death struggle, had burned away the last of the distance between us, leaving something raw and undeniable in its place. Darius turned to me, his chest heaving, his eyes blazing with a fierce, possessive fire. He crossed the room in 2 strides, his hands immediately checking me for injuries, his fingers tracing my arms, my face, as if to assure himself I was real and unharmed. "Are you hurt?" he growled, his voice thick with the aftermath of battle. "No," I whispered, my own hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the frantic, powerful beat of his heart beneath my palms. "I'm okay." His gaze dropped to my lips. The air grew thick, charged with a tension that had nothing to do with the fight and everything to do with the man and woman left in its wake. "I will not lose you, Celine," he breathed, his voice a low, ragged promise. And then his mouth was on mine. The kiss was an explosion. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was a desperate claiming act, a release of all the pent-up fear, the unspoken desire, the terrifying connection that had been simmering between us since that first night. I kissed him back with a ferocity that surprised me, my fingers tangling in his dark hair, pulling him closer. This was not the poisoned kiss of Jackson. This was a wildfire, a claiming of souls that was both terrifying and intoxicating. He backed me against the wall, his powerful body pressing me into the cool stone, his hands framing my face as his lips left mine to trace a burning path down my neck. The bond, that humming, living thing between us was now a roaring inferno screaming for completion, his fangs elongated, grazing the sensitive skin just above my collarbone. He was going to mark me. He was going to seal us, right here, right now, forever. And I wanted him to. Goddess, I wanted it. I arched my neck, giving him access, my entire being crying out for the claiming bite. And then he froze. A choked, agonized gasp was torn from his throat, and he pulled back as if he'd been burned. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a fresh wave of horror and self-loathing. The ghost of his first mate, Ilara, stood between us, her memory a wall of ice. "I can't," he whispered, his voice broken. He shook his head, stumbling back. "This is the bond, the instinct. It isn't me. I can't." He couldn't separate the primal need of his wolf from the conscious choice of his heart. He thought this overwhelming desire was just a byproduct of his curse, his failure, and not a choice. The rejection, coming in this moment of ultimate vulnerability, was more devastating than Jackson's could ever have been. Tears pricked my eyes. Heartbroken, confused, and utterly humiliated, I turned and stumbled away from him, needing air, needing to escape the suffocating intensity of the room. I pushed past the ruined tapestries and shoved open a door that led to a small, deserted stone balcony. The cool night air was a shock against my heated skin. I leaned against the balustrade, my body trembling, trying to make sense of the man who would kill for me but couldn't bring himself to claim me. I never heard the footsteps. A hand, reeking of sweat and fear, clamped hard over my mouth. An arm like a band of iron wrapped around my waist, lifting me off my feet. I tried to scream, but the sound was a muffled, useless squeak. The attack on the study, it wasn't the main assault, it was a diversion. As I was dragged backward into the shadows of the palace, away from the king, away from any hope of rescue, the last thing I saw was the empty doorway of the study, a silent testament to a moment that had promised forever and delivered only ruin. I awoke to the chilling cold of stone on my back and the foul metallic taste of blood in my mouth. My head throbbed, a dull pounding drum of pain. My wrists and ankles were bound tight with rough rope, stretching me out over a large, flat altar. The air was frigid and smelled of damp earth, mildew, and something else. Something acrid and coppery, like old magic. I was in a dungeon, or some forgotten cellar deep beneath the palace. And I was not alone. "She's awake," a voice hissed. My vision cleared, focusing on the figure standing over me. Jackson. But this was not the proud alpha heir I knew. His eyes were hollow, burning with a crazed, triumphant light. His fine clothes were disheveled and strange. Dark symbols were painted on his face. He looked like a fanatic, a man who had traded his sanity for power. Hooded figures, their faces lost in shadow, stood in a circle around the altar, their voices a low, guttural chant in a language that made my skin crawl. The stone floor around me was a complex web of glowing crimson runes, pulsing with a weak but steady light. "Hello, mate," Jackson sneered, the word a poison dart. "You thought you could escape me. The king can't protect you from destiny. What the goddess has joined together, only magic can tear asunder." He raised his hands, and the chanting grew louder. The glowing runes on the floor brightened. The rite of severance. It was real, and it was happening. It began not as a sharp pain, but as a strange, unpleasant pulling sensation deep within my soul. It was the bond, the fragile, powerful connection I had to Darius. The magic was plucking at it, trying to unravel the threads of fate that connected us. I gritted my teeth, fighting against the sensation. But the pulling grew stronger, more insistent. It became a sharp, tearing agony, as if my very spirit was being stretched to its breaking point. A scream was torn from my throat, a raw, helpless sound that was swallowed by the relentless chanting. And through the bond, I could feel him. I could feel Darius. I felt his initial confusion when he realized I was gone from the balcony. That confusion turned to a sharp, cold panic. Then, as the ritual began, his panic exploded into a supernova of incandescent, unrestrained rage. He knew. Somehow, he knew what they were doing to me. And the ritual, it wasn't just hurting me. The bond was a bridge, and my agony was flowing across it, straight into him. I could feel a phantom echo of my pain tearing through his soul, a feedback loop of torment. The chanters were not just trying to sever our connection, They were using me as a weapon to destroy him from the inside out. The tearing sensation intensified, and I screamed again. I felt the bond fraying, its light dimming. With every thread that snapped, the pain in Darius grew. I could feel his wolf, the powerful, controlled beast, begin to thrash against the walls of his control, driven mad by the agony of its mate being tortured. I saw a flash of a future, his wolf breaking free, a mindless engine of destruction, tearing apart his own palace, his own people, in its desperate, insane attempt to find me. The ritual wouldn't just shred my soul. It would destroy him. It would unmake the king. In that moment of absolute, searing agony, a strange clarity pierced through my terror. I had spent my entire life as a victim, a traitor's daughter, a rejected mate, a king's complication. But now I had a choice. I could lie here and let this dark magic destroy us both. Or I could do the one thing they would never expect. I could save him. I had to be the one to break it. I had to cut the connection before it could be used to kill him. Gathering every last shred of my will, I closed my eyes and focused inward, not on my own pain, but on the fraying, agonizing bond. I focused on the image of Darius in my mind, the king, the beast, the haunted man who had confessed his scars to me by the firelight, the man who had begged fate to take him instead of me. I clung to that image, to the feeling of his soul intertwined with mine, and I prepared to tear it out by the roots. A single broken whisper, thick with blood and tears, tore from my lips. It was an echo of the words that had begun my nightmare, but this time they were not a curse I received, but a sacrifice I was giving. My choice, my weapon, my salvation for him. I reject you. The instant the words left my mouth, the bond didn't just fray, it didn't tear. It snapped, a psychic shockwave of pure, final severance. In the last, dying ember of our connection, I felt an explosion of agony from Darius that was 1,000 times worse than my own. It was the sound of a soul being hollowed out. It was the sound of his wolf, its anchor suddenly gone, finally breaking free in a silent psychic roar of absolute world-ending fury. And then, my own world went silent. The pain vanished, replaced by a vast, cold, and terrifying emptiness. My soul was a hollow cavern, echoing with the ghost of what it had lost. My consciousness, with nothing left to hold on to, simply faded away into white. Waking was like surfacing in an ocean of gray. There was no pain, no fire in my veins, no agony of a soul being torn. There was only nothing. A vast, silent, hollow space inside my chest where a humming, vibrant connection used to be. I sat up in my bed, the silk sheets feeling like sandpaper against my skin. The world outside the window was bright, the sky a brilliant blue, but all I saw were muted, washed-out colors, as if a veil of ash had been draped over my eyes. A vase of vibrant, sweet-smelling roses sat on the bedside table. I could see that they were red, but I couldn't feel their beauty. I could smell their fragrance, but it was just a fact, an empty piece of data that sparked no pleasure, no memory. The bond had been more than a connection to Darius. It had been a connection to the world itself. And now, it was gone. The royal healer came, his kind face etched with a deep, professional worry. He told me I had been unconscious for 2 days. He said that physically I was healing from my ordeal at an astonishing rate, a testament to my unique bloodline. But he couldn't hide the concern in his eyes. "Your spirit, my lady," he said, his voice hesitant. "Your inner wolf. It is quiet. Dangerously so. It's as if the fire has gone out." I could have told him why. You can't have a fire without a spark. The bond had been the spark, and I had been the one to extinguish it. I had saved Darius, but I had gutted myself in the process. "And the king?" I asked, my voice a dull, lifeless thing. The healer's gaze darted nervously towards the door. His Majesty is not receiving visitors. Later, a young guard, one of the few who still looked at me with sympathy instead of fear, brought me a tray of food I wouldn't touch. He lingered, his expression troubled. "He went to the dungeons himself, my lady," the guard whispered, his voice barely audible. "When he found you gone, and what the alpha heir was doing, the king's wolf took over completely." The guard swallowed hard, the memory clearly terrifying. "He destroyed the ritual chamber, tore the heir's accomplices apart. Jackson himself was shielded by the last of the ritual's magic. But he is broken. The king has locked himself in his private wing. The sounds we hear from behind the doors, they are not human. So I had succeeded. I had saved him from the ritual's feedback, only to unleash the beast I'd once anchored. The irony was a bitter, tasteless pill. He was lost in the storm of his own nature, and the one person who could calm him, the one person whose touch could bring him back, was now a stranger to his soul. My isolation became official that afternoon. The council, or what was left of it, a new body of opportunistic lords scrambling to fill the power vacuum left by the traitors, had convened an emergency session. Without a strong king to temper them, their fear and ambition ran wild. I heard the proclamation being cried in the halls by a royal herald, his voice ringing with self-important authority. "Let it be known," the voice boomed, echoing in the marble corridors, "that the woman known as Celine, by her own unnatural actions, has caused the severing of a sacred mate bond. In doing so, she has brought ruin upon an alpha heir and has unleashed a perilous madness within our king. She is hereby declared a bond breaker, a cursed entity, a source of profound instability to the throne. She is to be stripped of all royal privilege and held in isolated containment until a final judgment can be rendered." The words washed over me, and I felt nothing. No anger, no fear, no injustice, just a dull, hollow resonance. They were calling me a curse, a pariah. They were locking me away. But I was already gone. They were just building walls around an empty house. I walked to the ornate mirror that hung on the wall, a mirror that had once shown me a frightened girl in a midnight blue gown. Now it reflected a stranger with dead eyes and a hollow space where her heart used to be. I spent the next day in that strange, silent limbo, a prisoner in a room fit for a queen. I was a ghost at a feast, surrounded by luxury that had no meaning. Then, late in the afternoon, the captain of the guard appeared at my door, his expression unreadable. "You have a visitor," he announced, his voice flat. He looked confused. "She claims to be your mother." The words didn't register at first. Mother? The word was foreign, a name from a story I'd read a long time ago. The woman who had vanished from my life when I was 6 years old, right after my father was branded a traitor. The woman who had left me to face the whispers, the sneers, the loneliness, all by myself. And now she was here. She was led into the room, and my breath caught. It was her, Alora. She was older, of course, her once smooth face now a fine web of lines etched by hardship, but she was still painfully beautiful. The moment her eyes landed on me, they filled with tears. She rushed forward, her arms open. I instinctively flinched back. "Celine," she sobbed, her hands fluttering in the space between us. "Oh, my sweet girl. Can you ever forgive me?" I stared at her, the hollow space inside me aching with a phantom pain. "Forgive you?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. "You left me." "I had to," she insisted, tears streaming down her face. "They would have killed me too, don't you see? After what they did to your father, I was a loose end. I ran to survive. But I never stopped thinking of you. Never." She took a hesitant step closer. "And when I heard that the king himself had claimed you, I knew it was safe to come back. I knew my powerful daughter would protect me." Her words were a torrent of excuses and self-interest, and yet, this was my mother. The only parent I had left. A desperate, treacherous seed of hope, tiny and fragile, began to sprout in the barren wasteland of my soul. I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe in someone. She must have seen the conflict in my eyes, because her expression softened. "You have his eyes," she whispered, her voice full of a genuine aching love. "Ronan, he was the bravest man I ever knew. He loved you so much, Celine. He used to say your laugh was like a handful of silver bells." She spoke of him. She shared small, perfect memories, the way he would carve little wooden wolves for me, the sound of his deep voice humming as he sharpened his blades. She brought the hero from the king's letter to life. She was the only other person in the world who knew the truth. My defenses crumbled. My desperate need for comfort, for family, for one single person to trust, overwhelmed a decade of bitterness. I let her pull me into an embrace, and I sobbed into her shoulder, a storm of grief and loneliness and despair finally breaking free. I told her everything, about the bond, about Darius, about the sacrifice I'd made, and the terrible, aching emptiness it had left behind. She held me, stroking my hair, murmuring soothing words. "Oh, my poor brave girl," she cooed. "You did it to save him. Of course you did. You have your father's heart." She pulled back, her eyes shining with a fierce maternal fire. "Don't you worry. I will make this right. I will go to this new council myself. I will tell them who you are, what you did. I will make them understand." Hope, bright and dizzying, flooded through me. My mother, she would be my witness. She would save me. I clung to her, a drowning woman clutching a piece of driftwood. "Thank you," I choked out. "Thank you. Anything for my daughter," she said, kissing my forehead. Then she left, her steps full of purpose, on her way to clear my name. Hours passed. I waited, pacing the room, that fragile hope growing with every passing minute. Maybe this was it, the turning point. The heavy sound of armored boots approaching my door made me look up, a smile ready on my face. It was too soon for her to be back, but maybe she had sent a messenger. The door swung open. It was the captain of the guard. And he was not alone. 2 other guards stood behind him, their faces grim. In their hands, they held heavy iron chains. My smile faltered. "What is this?" The captain's eyes were cold, devoid of the pity they'd held before. He held up a scroll. "By order of the acting council," he said, his voice a death knell. "On the sworn testimony of your mother, Alora, who has confirmed your unnatural and dangerous abilities to sever a sacred bond at will, you are hereby condemned as a threat to the natural order." The world dissolved into a roaring in my ears. On the testimony of your mother. She hadn't gone to save me. She had gone to sell me. She had taken my confession, my pain, my trust, and had twisted it into a weapon to secure her own safety with the new regime. The fragile hope inside me didn't just die. It was murdered. As the cold, heavy cuffs closed around my wrists, the last ember of warmth in my soul went out for good. The last vestiges of my royal treatment were stripped away with the silk dress they tore from my back. The cell they threw me into was not just a room without a key. It was a true dungeon, a place of weeping stone and absolute despair. They dressed me in a rough, scratchy prisoner's shift that smelled of mildew and fear. The air was cold and damp, a physical manifestation of the hollowness that had consumed me. There was no bed, only a thin pile of straw in the corner. No window, only the oppressive, crushing weight of tons of rock and earth above me. The clanging slam of the iron-barred door was a sound of absolute finality. This was the end of the line. I sank onto the filthy straw, the heavy chains on my wrists a comforting, tangible weight. They were real. They were honest. Unlike everything else in my life. In the suffocating darkness, I replayed it all. A cruel, cosmic joke played out in acts. The impossible hope of the mate bond with Jackson, shattered by his disgust. The terrifying, possessive claim of the king, which blossomed into a fragile, vulnerable trust, only to be severed by my own hand. The kindness of a maid. a mask for a desperate betrayal. And finally, the return of my mother, a specter of hope who had appeared only to deliver the killing blow. Every time I had reached for connection, every time I had dared to trust, the universe had conspired to prove what a fool I was. Fate wasn't just indifferent, it was malicious, it enjoyed the show. What a joke my legacy was. Descendant of the first Luna, blessed by the goddess, a destiny. It was all a lie, a beautifully crafted story told to a gullible child. My power hadn't brought me glory. It had brought me pain, made me a target, and driven a king to madness. It wasn't a gift. It was the very curse everyone had always accused me of carrying. Sometime later, hours or minutes, time had no meaning here. Heavy footsteps echoed in the corridor. A torch's light cast long, dancing shadows through the bars of my cell. It was the new council lord, a man named Gregor with a hungry look in his eyes, the kind of man who thrives in the chaos of a fallen regime. He held a scroll in his hand, his expression one of grim satisfaction. "Celine of the former Silvermoon Pack," he began, his voice unctuous and formal. He unrolled the scroll with a snap. "For crimes against the stability of the kingdom, for the magical ensnarement and subsequent madness of King Darius, and for carrying a bloodline deemed uncontrollably dangerous to the natural order of our people, the council has reached its verdict." He looked up, savoring the moment, his eyes gleaming in the torchlight. "You are sentenced to death by injected silver. The execution will be carried out at dawn." He waited for a reaction, for me to scream, to plead, to cry. But I felt nothing. The words didn't even register as a threat. They registered as a release. The fight was over. The struggle that had defined every single moment of my existence was finally, mercifully, at an end. There was nothing left to fight for. There was no one left to believe in. I was just tired. So profoundly tired. A weariness that went bone deep, soul deep. "So be it," I whispered. The Lord looked disappointed by my lack of hysterics. He rolled up his scroll and left, his footsteps fading away, leaving me once more in the profound and welcoming darkness. Dawn. It wasn't far away. I curled up on the cold stone floor, the chains a heavy, final embrace. I finally had the answer to the question that had haunted my entire life, the question that had flickered in the back of my mind through every sneer, every rejection, every moment of hope, and every plunge into despair. Am I cursed to be unloved or chosen to be the one love that cannot be denied? The answer was so simple, so obvious. It had been staring me in the face all along. I had been chosen only for mockery, for pain. The other option was a fairy tale for other girls. Girls who weren't born under a cursed star. Girls who weren't stained by a traitor's blood. Girls who weren't me. I closed my eyes, a strange, hollow peace settling over me. The struggle was done. I whispered the truth into the silent, waiting darkness of my tomb, a final, heartbreaking admission of my fate. Maybe I was never meant to be loved. The snap was a soundless, psychic cataclysm. One moment, a faint, agonizing thread of her soul was still intertwined with his. The next, nothing. A void. A clean, silent severance that was more violent than any scream. The wolf inside him, the beast that had been howling in shared agony, was suddenly thrown into a bottomless, silent freefall. Its anchor, the one fragile point of light in its universe, had just been extinguished. And in the absolute, terrifying silence where she used to be, the beast went mad. Darius remembered the rage only in flashes, in shards of red-tinged memory. The scent of Jackson's terror, the satisfying crunch of bone under his claws, the splintering of stone as he tore through the dungeon walls. His guards, his loyal, hardened royal guard, had been unable to stop him, and he'd savaged them for trying. He only stopped when the last of the traitorous chanters lay silent and still, the ritual's foul magic finally broken. But it was too late. She was gone. Not dead. The wolf would have known death, but erased. wiped from his senses, from his soul. He retreated. He locked himself in his private wing, a wounded animal seeking a den to bleed out in, and he let the wolf rage. For days, it was the only thing that was real. It tore apart priceless tapestries, shredded ancient furniture, and left claw marks deep in the stone walls. It howled its grief and fury into the uncaring silence, a king reduced to a mindless, broken creature. But the wolf's fury could not burn forever. It eventually exhausted itself, collapsing into a heap of trembling, heartbroken instinct. And in the quiet that followed, the man was left to deal with the wreckage. Darius sat on the floor of his ruined chambers, surrounded by the physical manifestation of his own failure. The world was gray. The food his guards left outside his door had no taste. The wine was like ash in his mouth. Without the bond, without her, the color and flavor had been leached from his reality. He had failed. Again. He had let his first mate die, and his wolf had never forgiven him. He had let his second mate be tortured, and he hadn't even been able to feel her pass from the world. No, that wasn't right. She hadn't just passed. She had done something. The rejection, he had felt it. A whisper from her soul to his in the final agonizing moment. I reject you. She had done it. She had severed the bond herself. Why? The answer hit him with the force of a physical blow, to save him. She had felt the ritual tearing him apart through their connection, and she had chosen to sacrifice her own soul to stop his pain. The memory of their last moments together crashed over him. The desperate kiss, the feel of her in his arms, and his own weakness, his guilt. I can't. He had pulled back. He had looked at this incredible, brave, resilient woman, and had thrown the ghost of his past in her face. He hadn't just failed to protect her. He had rejected her in her most vulnerable moment, moments before she was stolen from him. He finally admitted the truth to the roaring silence in his soul. It wasn't just the bond. It wasn't just the wolf's instinct. It was him. He, Darius, the man, had been falling for her. Her fire, her defiance, the quiet strength that had allowed her to stand up to a whole pack, to him, to everyone. He didn't just want his mate. He wanted Celine, and he had driven her away. A firm, official knock sounded at his door. Your Majesty, a voice called out. Gregor, the opportunistic weasel who now led the council. We have reached a verdict regarding the instability. We require your seal. Darius rose, his movements stiff. He opened the door. Gregor stood there, flanked by two other lords, a scroll in his hand. He tried and failed to hide his shock at the sight of the king's disheveled state and the destruction behind him. We have determined, for the good of the kingdom, that the source of the chaos must be purged, Gregor said, his voice slick. He held out the scroll. It was a death warrant. Her name was written on it in elegant, damning script. The law is clear. She is a threat. Grant us your seal, and we can restore order. This was it, the choice. The kingdom, or the woman who had sacrificed her soul for him. The law, or the love he had been too cowardly to admit. He looked at Gregor's smug, expectant face. He looked at the piece of paper that would murder the other half of his soul. And in that moment, the king who was bound by duty died. The wolf and the man, for the first time since she was gone, agreed on a course of action. He didn't take the scroll. He took Gregor by the throat. He lifted the sputtering lord off the ground, his eyes blazing with a cold, purposeful fury that was far more terrifying than the wolf's mindless rage. You have sentenced my mate to death, Darius growled, the sound a low, vibrating promise of war. In doing so, you have sentenced this kingdom to ruin. He threw the man into the wall like a rag doll and let out a roar that shook the palace. This was not the howl of a grieving beast. It was a king's declaration of war. He bellowed for his royal guard, his voice a command that would not be denied. He was no longer a monarch managing a complication. He was a mate coming to claim his other half, and he would burn the world to the ground to get her back. The darkness of the dungeon had become a strange, final comfort. I sat on the cold floor, my back against the damp stone wall, and waited for the dawn. There was no fear left, no anger, only a profound and weary resignation. I had made my peace with the end. So when the sound of heavy, approaching footsteps echoed in the corridor, followed by the metallic scrape of a key in the lock, I felt nothing. It was time. My executioner had come. I rose to my feet, my chains clinking in the oppressive silence, determined to meet my fate standing. I would not die cowering in the straw. I was Ronan's daughter. I would die like one. The heavy iron door groaned open, spilling the flickering orange light of a torch into my cell. But the man who stood there was not the executioner I expected. My breath hitched. It was Cale, the stern mountain of a man Beta from my old pack, and behind him, crammed into the narrow corridor, were at least a dozen other Silvermoon warriors. Their faces were grim, their eyes hard as flint, and their hands rested on the hilts of their swords. They were not here to witness a death. They were here for a war. I stared, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. Was this a trick? Another cruel joke from a malicious fate? Cale took a step inside, his massive frame seeming to shrink the tiny cell. He dropped to one knee, his head bowed. The gesture was so full of respect, so utterly unexpected, that it felt like a physical blow. "We are not all blind fools, my lady," he said, his voice a low, rumbling thunder of conviction. He held out a small iron key. "And we are not all oath breakers." My eyes darted from his kneeling form to the warriors behind him, their faces a mixture of grim determination and loyalty. I didn't understand. "They all hate me," I whispered, the words a raw, broken thing. "My name is a curse." "Not to us," Cale said, his gaze lifting to meet mine. It was fierce, and for the first time, I saw an echo of my father in its depths. When the King's Guard arrested the Alpha heir, the truth began to unravel. Many of us, the older guard who served with your father, we never truly believed the stories of his treason. It was not in his character. He took a breath, his voice thick with an old, buried grief. "Ronan was the most loyal wolf I ever knew. He died protecting his king, his Alpha. We will not stand by and watch his daughter be murdered on the word of cowards and the lies of traitors." He pushed the key into my chained hands. My fingers were clumsy, numb from the cold and the shock. But I managed to fit it into the lock of my manacles. With a loud click, the chains fell away, crashing onto the stone floor with a sound of impossible freedom. I rubbed my raw wrists, the feeling of release so sudden, so overwhelming that I almost stumbled. But it wasn't the absence of the chains that took my breath away. It was the look in their eyes. The warriors behind Cale were no longer just watching. They were kneeling. One by one, the hardened soldiers of the Silvermoon pack were bending a knee to me. They weren't looking at a bond breaker, a curse, an omen. They were looking at Ronan's daughter. They were looking at her as if she were their leader, as if she were their Luna. They had chosen me. Not because of a fated bond, not because of a king's decree, but because of who I was, who my father had been. The vast, aching hollowness in my soul didn't disappear, but deep within its echoing emptiness, a tiny, defiant spark ignited. A flicker of warmth I thought I would never feel again. Hope. Just as I was processing this impossible turn of events, a thunderous roar echoed from the upper levels of the palace. It was a sound of pure, righteous fury, followed instantly by the clang of steel on steel and the shouts of men. The battle had begun. Cale rose to his feet, a grim smile touching his lips. "That will be the king," he said, his voice full of respect. "He is coming for you, and we will stand with you both." He offered me his hand to help me up. I looked at his outstretched hand, then at the determined faces of the warriors who had risked everything for me. For my father's memory. They were waiting for me to be rescued. They were expecting me to be the prize, the damsel to be saved. But the girl who had resigned herself to death was gone. In her place was a woman forged in betrayal and fire, the heir to a sacred legacy. And she was done being a victim. I ignored his hand, and instead took a sword from the sheath of the warrior nearest to me. The weapon was heavy, its balance unfamiliar, but holding it felt right. It felt like coming home. The spark inside me grew into a small, hot flame. "No," I said, my voice clear and strong, ringing with a newfound authority in the small stone cell. "We will go to him." The palace had transformed into a war zone. The cold, silent halls I had walked as a prisoner were now alive with the chaotic symphony of battle. The clang of swords, the snarls of wolves fighting in close quarters, and the shouts of men echoed off the marble walls. I moved through the fighting, flanked by Kale and his loyal Silver Moon warriors, a strange, calm fire burning where my despair had been. This was no longer just a fight for my life. It was a fight for my father's honor, for the men who had knelt to me in the darkness, and for the king who was tearing his own palace apart to reach me. We fought our way upward, a tide of grim determination against the panicked, desperate guards loyal to the traitorous council. I was not a trained warrior. My movements were clumsy, driven by pure instinct, but the sword in my hand felt like an extension of my will. I parried a clumsy sword thrust from a council guard, the shock of the impact rattling my bones, and Kale was there an instant later to disarm him. We were a unit, a pack, and we would not be stopped. We broke through a hastily erected barricade of overturned furniture and found him. In the center of a wide, pillared hall, Darius was a whirlwind of black leather and silver steel. He was magnificent, terrifying. The wolf and the man were one, a seamless, lethal entity of pure, focused purpose. He was a storm of destruction, his movements a blur as he cut a path through the council's men, his eyes fixed on the far end of the hall, towards the dungeons, towards where he thought I still was. Then he saw me. He froze for a single, heart-stopping second, a statue in the eye of the hurricane. His enemies, seeing a moment's weakness, tried to press their advantage, but his royal guard closed ranks around him. He saw me, not chained, not broken, but alive, free, with a sword in my hand and a dozen warriors at my back. Our eyes locked across the chaos, and in that instant, the world fell away. There was no bond, no magical, irresistible pull. There was only a profound, silent recognition that transcended magic, a connection forged not by fate, but by choice, by sacrifice, by fire. He saw a partner, and I saw my king. With a roar, he renewed his assault, but this time he was not just fighting his way to me. He was fighting his way back to me. I met him halfway, Kale and my warriors covering my advance. When he finally reached my side, the battle raging around us, there was no time for words, for apologies, for explanations. There was only the raw, undeniable truth of us, standing together against the world. His eyes, so full of 1,000 regrets and a burning, silent promise, drank me in. He reached to his belt and pulled out a long, wickedly sharp silver dagger. He pressed the hilt into my hand. "Stay by my side," he growled. And it was not a command to a possession. It was a plea to an equal. "Always," I breathed. It was our beginning. Together, we were an unstoppable force. His strength and skill, my desperate ferocity. We led the combined might of his royal guard and the loyal Silver Moon warriors, a united front that smashed through the last of the resistance. We fought our way to the grand, ornate doors of the throne room. They were barred from the inside. The last of the traitors, with Gregor at their head, were making their final, desperate stand within. As Darius and Kale prepared their men to batter down the doors, a single brilliant beam of white light pierced through a high arched window, cutting through the smoky, dim hall. I looked up. The full moon, perfect and luminous, was rising in the night sky, its light a divine, silent witness to our war. And then I felt it. Deep inside the hollow, empty cavern of my soul, a phantom pain flared to life. It was an echo, a ghost. The severed bond, dormant and dead, suddenly ached with a surge of uncontrollable residual power, awakened by the moon's sacred light. It was like a limb that had been amputated, but could still feel a phantom itch, an impossible sensation. The power had nowhere to go, no connection to complete. It began to build inside me a painful, terrifying pressure. The final battle was about to begin, and the goddess herself, it seemed, was not yet finished with me. The great doors of the throne room, the last barrier between them and the traitors, splintered and burst inward with a final explosive crash. On the far side of the chamber, Gregor and the last dozen of his co-conspirators stood cornered, using the massive carved throne of the kingdom as their final pathetic barricade. Their faces were pale with the terror of cornered rats, their swords held with none of the confidence of true warriors. This was not a battle. It was an extermination. With a unified roar, the loyalists charged. Darius was a blur of righteous fury at the forefront, his royal guard moving with lethal precision at his side. Kale and the Silver Moon warriors crashed forward like a wave of avenging steel. I was swept along with them. The silver dagger Darius had given me a cold, steady weight in my hand. The hollow space in my soul was now a storm, the phantom energy of the full moon surging within me, a painful, chaotic pressure building behind my eyes. It made my movements jerky, my vision swim. It was a power with no outlet, a river with no sea, and it was threatening to tear me apart from the inside. We crashed into the traitor's defensive line. I ducked under a wild sword swing, my dagger finding a gap in the man's armor, my movements clumsy but driven by a desperate, cold fire. Kale finished him with a single, efficient blow before moving on to the next. All around me was the chaos of battle, but my focus kept being drawn to Darius. He fought with a terrible, beautiful grace, a king reclaiming his castle, his every movement a testament to the power I had once anchored and had then unleashed. Suddenly, a side door to the dais, one I hadn't even noticed, creaked open. A figure stumbled out, and my blood ran cold. Jackson. He was a wreck, his face bruised and gaunt, his eyes lit with the fires of utter madness. He was clutching a jagged, dark obsidian shard, an artifact that pulsed with a foul, dark energy. "If I can't have you," he screamed, his voice a cracked, unhinged shriek that cut through the sounds of battle, "then no one can." He began to chant. The words were the same guttural, soul-scraping language from the dungeon, but this time they were fueled by the artifact in his hand. The painful pressure inside me intensified 100-fold. The phantom bond writhed like a dying serpent, and Jackson's dark magic latched onto it, pouring its destructive, soul-shredding poison directly into me. It was a battle being fought within the ruins of my own spirit. The burgeoning power of the moon drawn to my sacred bloodline clashed with the dark, unraveling magic of the severing ritual. My knees buckled. A strangled cry of pure agony was torn from my lips. I collapsed to the floor, the silver dagger clattering from my nerveless fingers. Blood, warm and metallic, trickled from my nose, from my lips. It felt like my very atoms were being pulled in two different directions. I was dying. I was being unmade. "Celine!" Darius's roar of pure terror was the last thing I heard clearly. He was trying to fight his way through the remaining traitors to get to me, his face a mask of horrified desperation. Through the red haze of my own agony, I saw him, my king, my mate, the man I had sacrificed my soul for. And in that moment, a strange, transcendent clarity pierced through the pain. The first time in the dungeon, I had rejected the bond to save his life. The ritual had ended, but it had left me hollow and him a beast. That wasn't the answer. The opposite of rejection wasn't nothingness. It was acceptance. It was a choice. My bloodline was the legacy of the first Luna, a power not of severance but of connection. That was the key. I had to choose him. Not because fate demanded it, not because a bond commanded it, but because I wanted to. I lifted my head, my eyes finding his across the chaos. My love for him, born of shared scars and forged in battle, was the one clear, undeniable truth in a world of pain. It was mine. It was my power. Through bloodied lips, I whispered the two words that held the power to remake the world. "I choose you." The moment the words were spoken, they acted as a key. The brilliant white light of the full moon blazing through the high window ceased to be passive. It focused, converged, and then lanced downward in a single blindingly pure beam of silver fire. It struck me not with force, but with a feeling of absolute divine grace. The pain vanished, replaced by an incandescent power that flooded every cell of my being. And then, that power exploded outward. It was not a blast of destruction, but a wave of pure, sacred light, the moon goddess's final, undeniable answer to the chaos. The throne room, the battle, the entire world disappeared in a flash of silent, silver incandescence. The silence that followed the explosion of light was absolute. It was a sacred, profound quiet that absorbed all sound, all motion, all violence. The air, which moments before had been thick with the scent of sweat and blood, now smelled of clean ozone, of summer rain after a lightning strike. As the brilliant silver incandescence slowly faded, the throne room was revealed, transformed. The battle was over. Gregor and the last of his traitors lay on the floor, not dead, but unconscious, their dark intentions purged by the divine light. Of Jackson, there was nothing left but a small pile of fine black ash and the dead, cracked obsidian shard he had used, his dark magic utterly consumed. And in the center of the room, in the very spot where the moonlight had struck, Celine stood. She was untouched, unharmed. The blood was gone from her face. Her torn and filthy clothes seemed to radiate a soft inner light. The agonizing, chaotic pressure in her soul was gone, replaced by a warm, powerful, and constant hum. She was whole. She felt it instantly. The bond. It was back. But this was not the confusing, sometimes painful spark that had been forced upon her in the Great Hall. This was not the phantom echo that had ached in the moonlight. This was a deep, resonant, and perfectly forged connection. It was a river of golden light that flowed from her soul directly to his, a current of pure love, understanding, and strength. It felt chosen. It felt like coming home. She looked up and met his eyes. Darius was standing a few feet away, his sword lowered, staring at her. The looks on the faces of the warriors around them, Kael, the Silver Moon Loyalists, the Royal Guard, was one of utter, reverent awe. They had just witnessed a miracle. They were no longer looking at Celine, the traitor's daughter, or Celine, the king's controversial mate. They were looking at the chosen of the goddess. Slowly, one by one, they began to kneel. It started with Kael, the proud, stern beta who had risked everything for his memory of her father, lowered himself to one knee, his head bowed in absolute reverence. Then his warriors followed suit. Then the royal guard, the king's own elite soldiers, knelt before the woman their king had chosen. In the space of a few heartbeats, a room full of the kingdom's most powerful wolves were on their knees, their heads bowed not to their king, but to her. Darius was the only one left standing. He walked through the sea of kneeling warriors, his eyes never leaving hers. The awe and reverence on his face were deeper, more profound than anyone's. The king who had fought against being ruled by fate, who had feared the instincts of his own wolf, was now face to face with a power far greater than any law or lineage. He had seen the goddess herself reach down and claim his mate as her own. He reached her, and the look in his eyes was one of pure, unadulterated love, a love finally free from the ghosts of his past. He didn't pull her into a possessive embrace. He didn't kiss her. He did something far more powerful. In front of his guard, in front of her warriors, in front of the silent, watching eyes of the moon, the king knelt. He took her hand, his touch sending a wave of warmth through the newly forged bond. He bowed his proud head. "You are the daughter of Ronan, the heir to the first Luna, and the chosen of the goddess," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide, his words ringing with conviction for all to hear. He looked up then, his golden eyes shining with a love that was finally, truly his own choice. But more than any of that, You are the choice of my heart." He brought her hand to his lips, his gaze never wavering. My Luna. The title, once a source of her greatest humiliation and deepest fear, was now the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. It was not a brand of ownership. It was a vow, a promise, a crown. Later, after the traitors had been secured in the dungeons and the palace had begun to stir back to a fragile, exhausted life, they found their way back to his chambers. The wreckage from his wolf's grief had been cleared away. A fire roared in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow over the room, chasing away the last of the shadows. For the first time since that terrible first night, they were truly alone. The war was over. The whispers were silenced. The ghosts had been laid to rest. All that was left was the quiet, steady, and radiant hum of the bond between them, a perfect, harmonious song that resonated in the space between their hearts. Celine stood by the fire, watching the flames dance, feeling a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. The hollowness that had been her constant companion for so long was gone, filled to overflowing with a warm, silver light. She was no longer a collection of broken pieces. She was whole. Darius came to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her back against the solid wall of his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his breath warm against her skin. They stood there in silence for a long moment, simply existing in this new, quiet reality they had fought so hard to win. "I'm sorry," he finally whispered, his voice a low, rough rumble against her ear. "For my fear, for my doubt. I let the ghost of my past dictate my future, and I almost lost you because of it." She turned in his arms to face him, her hands coming up to cup his jaw. She looked into his eyes and saw no king, no beast, only the man whose soul was now perfectly intertwined with hers. "And I'm sorry," she answered softly, "that I broke the bond, that I hurt you." "You didn't hurt me," he murmured, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. "You saved me. You always save me, Celine." And in his eyes, she saw the truth. There were no more apologies needed, no more explanations. Only this, only them. The conversation, having reached its end in words, now turned to a language far older, far more profound. He lowered his head, and his kiss was nothing like the desperate, explosive claiming in the study. It was soft, searching, full of a deep, reverent tenderness that spoke of a love that had been tested by fire and death, and had emerged eternal. This was not the wild, instinct-driven need of a wolf. It was the conscious, deliberate choice of a man who had found his other half. The slow burn that had tortured and teased them for so long finally had its release, a rising tide of passion that was both a sacred vow and a deeply human need. He lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing, and carried her to the vast bed of furs, their lips never parting. Every touch was a discovery. Every kiss was a promise. This was the claiming, not a mark of ownership, but a final, willing act of union. As he finally lowered his head to the curve of her neck, to the place where the bond hummed with the brightest intensity, she arched her back, a silent, willing offering of forever. The bite was a sharp, exquisite pleasure, a seal of fire and silver that sent a jolt of pure, divine energy through her. The bond didn't just solidify, it blazed. A soft, silver light filled the room, an echo of the goddess's blessing, wrapping them both in a holy, intimate embrace. In that moment, her transformation was complete. The frightened cleaning girl in the great hall, the rejected mate, the traitor's daughter, the king's complication, the cursed omen. They were all just ghosts of a girl she no longer was. Lying here in the arms of her king, marked as his and having marked him in return with her own soul, she was finally, truly, herself. The Luna Queen. She had spent a lifetime believing love was a curse designed to break her, a cruel joke played by a malicious fate. But as she lay in the arms of her king, her mate, her choice, a man who had knelt to her and fought for her, she finally understood the profound and simple truth of her existence. Love was never a curse, it was her crown. Thank you so much for watching this video. We really appreciate you spending your time with us. If you enjoyed what you saw, we've got a whole library of other videos packed with more great content just like this waiting for you on our channel. So why not dive into another one right now? And hey, if you want to make sure you don't miss out on our next upload, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. We'd love to have you join our community and see you in the next video. Thanks again.